I never thought my quiet stepson could turn my world upside down. That night, the creak of the floorboards outside my bedroom wasn't just the house settling. It was the moment everything changed. His silhouette appeared in the doorway, and when our eyes met, the tension was unmistakable. What happened next wasn't just shocking, it was unimaginable. And it all began with one look. Lucas had always been the quiet type, blending into the background as if he didn't want to disturb anyone. At 19, he had recently moved back in with us, caught in that delicate phase between boyhood and adulthood. My husband, Greg, was thrilled to have his son home again, even though his demanding job meant he was rarely around to enjoy it. As for me, I had no complaints. Lucas was polite, respectful, and mostly kept to himself. If anything, I welcomed the occasional company during Greg's frequent business trips. Our home had long been a place of solitude for me, with Greg's absences turning it into a silent retreat. But I didn't mind, I had grown used to the stillness. That evening started like so many others. Dinner was simple, just leftover pasta warmed up in the microwave. Lucas had offered to clean up afterward, as he always did, before retreating to his room. It was a routine we'd fallen into, predictable and safe. I relished those quiet evenings, using the time to pamper myself with long showers, soothing music, and my favorite silk nightgown, something I rarely wore, as it was usually meant for Greg's eyes only. But that night, something felt different. The air seemed heavier, as if holding its breath for what was to come. I had slipped into bed, the golden glow of the bedside lamp casting comforting shadows across the room, when I heard it, the faint creak of the floorboards outside my door. At first, I dismissed it as the house settling. This wasn't unusual in our older home, and I was no stranger to its quirks. But then it came again, a deliberate sound, unmistakably footsteps. My heart quickened, the serene moment I had been savoring shattering into unease. I glanced at the slightly ajar door, which I was certain I had closed earlier. And then I saw him. Lucas stood there, his expression caught between guilt and hesitation, his presence unsettling in a way I couldn't quite place. My voice faltered as I addressed him, unsure of what I was even trying to say. This wasn't the boy I thought I knew. Something had shifted, and the air between us seemed charged with an unspoken tension I couldn't ignore. In the days following that night, the air between Lucas and me changed in ways I couldn't explain. He continued to be polite, helpful even, but there was something beneath the surface, something unspoken that lingered like a shadow in every interaction. I told myself I was imagining things, that nothing had really happened. After all, he had left the room when I told him to, hadn't he? But then there were the little things, the lingering glances, the hesitations. It started innocently enough. He'd pause when we passed each other in the hallway, his eyes meeting mine for just a second too long before he looked away. Or the way his voice softened when he asked if I needed help with something. Small moments that, on their own, meant nothing, but together began to form a pattern I couldn't ignore. One evening, I was sitting in the living room reading, trying to distract myself, when Lucas came in. He hovered near the doorway, as though unsure whether he should stay or leave. Finally, he crossed the room and sat down on the far end of the couch. It wasn't unusual for him to join me, but tonight, the atmosphere felt different. He seemed tense, his fingers drumming lightly against his thigh as though his thoughts were miles away. "Everything okay?" I asked, trying to sound casual, though my heart was pounding in my chest. He nodded quickly, a little too quickly, and mumbled something about needing a break from his video games. But his posture told a different story. His shoulders were rigid, his gaze fixed on a spot just past me. I tried to brush it off, returning to my book, but I couldn't focus. I was hyper-aware of his presence, of the way his leg jiggled nervously, of the occasional sideways glance he thought I didn't notice. The room felt smaller, the air heavier, and I found myself gripping the book tighter, as if it could ground me in some way. Later that night, as I was getting ready for bed, I found myself staring at the crack in my bedroom door. I always closed it before sleeping, but suddenly, the memory of it being ajar the other night came rushing back. I hesitated for a moment, then got up and locked it, my heart racing as I turned the key. But even with the door locked, sleep didn't come easily. I tossed and turned, haunted by the look on Lucas's face when I'd caught him standing there. I told myself it was innocent, that he hadn't meant to make me uncomfortable. And yet deep down I knew better. There was something in his eyes that night, something I hadn't wanted to see but couldn't unsee now. The following morning, I caught him watching me again. I was making coffee, lost in my own thoughts, when I looked up and saw him standing in the kitchen doorway. He wasn't doing anything, just standing there, his gaze fixed on me. When our eyes met, he quickly looked away, muttering a half-hearted good morning before disappearing into his room. The unease that had been building inside me reached a boiling point. I tried to convince myself it was all in my head, that Lucas was just adjusting to being back home and didn't know how to act around me. But the truth was harder to ignore. The way he lingered, the way his eyes followed me, the way his presence seemed to fill the house, it was all too much. And I couldn't help but wonder. Was I imagining things? Or had something truly changed between us that night? It started subtly, with moments that seemed innocent enough, but carried a weight I couldn't ignore. Lucas began spending more time in the shared spaces of the house, always under the guise of needing something. A drink from the kitchen, a book he'd left in the living room. At first, I didn't think much of it. After all, it was his home too. But soon, those moments began to linger, stretching beyond what felt natural. One afternoon, I was folding laundry in the living room when Lucas walked in, his phone in hand. He sat on the couch, scrolling through his screen as though he had no real reason to be there. I glanced up at him, expecting him to leave after a moment, but he didn't. Instead, he leaned back, casually watching me as I worked. "Need something?" I asked, trying to keep my tone light. He shook his head, offering a small smile. "No, just bored. Thought I'd keep you company." The response was innocent, but the way his eyes lingered on me felt anything but. I turned my attention back to the laundry, my heart beating faster for reasons I couldn't explain. It wasn't just his presence. It was the way he watched me, the way the air seemed to grow heavier when we were alone. It wasn't long before these encounters started to escalate. He began finding excuses to be closer to me, reaching past me for something on the counter, brushing against me in the hallway. Each time my body tensed, a jolt of awareness shooting through me. I told myself it was nothing, that I was overthinking. But the truth was harder to dismiss. One evening, as I stood at the kitchen sink washing dishes, Lucas appeared beside me. He leaned against the counter, his arm brushing mine as he reached for a glass. "You've been quiet lately," he said, his voice soft. "Is everything okay?" I hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I'm fine," I said finally, keeping my gaze fixed on the soapy water. "Just busy." "You sure?" he pressed, his tone laced with concern. "You've seemed different since that night." The words hung in the air between us, heavy with unspoken meaning. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. For a moment, neither of us spoke, the sound of running water the only thing breaking the silence. "Lucas," I began, my voice trembling slightly. "That night, it was a misunderstanding. I don't want you to feel awkward about it." He nodded, but the look in his eyes told me he wasn't convinced. "It's not awkward," he said quietly. "At least, not for me." His words sent a shiver down my spine, and I turned to face him, my hands gripping the edge of the sink. "Lucas, we can't," I started, but my voice faltered. The intensity in his gaze made it impossible to finish the sentence. "I know," he said, stepping closer. "I know it's wrong. But that doesn't stop how I feel." The space between us felt smaller than it should have, and I found myself holding my breath, unsure of what to do. The logical part of me screamed to put distance between us, to shut this down before it spiraled out of control. But another part, the part that had been quietly stirring since that night, kept me rooted in place. "I've tried to ignore it," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper. "But I can't stop thinking about you." "Lucas," I said again, this time more firmly. "This isn't right." "Then tell me to stop," he said, his eyes locking onto mine. "If you really want me to, just say the word, and I'll leave you alone." I opened my mouth to respond, but the words wouldn't come. Instead, I found myself staring at him, caught in the intensity of his gaze. The air between us felt charged, electric, as though one wrong move could ignite something we couldn't undo. Finally, I broke the silence. "You're my stepson," I said, my voice trembling. "We can't do this." "I know," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "But it doesn't change how I feel." Before I could respond, he reached out, his hand brushing against mine where it rested on the counter. The touch was light, hesitant, but it sent a jolt through me that left me breathless. I should have pulled away, should have told him to stop. But I didn't. "Lucas, please," I whispered, though my voice lacked the conviction I wanted it to have. "This has to stop." "Then stop me," he said, his voice soft but insistent. I didn't move. The room seemed to close in around us, the world outside fading away until it was just the two of us. And in that moment, I knew the line we were teetering on was about to disappear entirely. The storm I'd been trying to ignore finally broke that evening. The tension that had built over the last few days came to a head in a way I hadn't anticipated and couldn't control. Greg had left for another business trip earlier that morning, leaving Lucas and me alone in the house once more. I busied myself with chores and errands, hoping to keep my mind occupied, but it was no use. Every time I caught a glimpse of Lucas, his quick smiles, the way he lingered just a little too long in the same room, I felt the pull of something I couldn't name. By the time evening rolled around, the weight of it all had me on edge. I retreated to my bedroom, desperate for some space, for a moment to breathe. I locked the door behind me as had become my habit and sank onto the bed, closing my eyes in an attempt to push the thoughts from my mind. But the quiet didn't last long. A faint knock at the door made my eyes snap open, my heart immediately racing. I didn't answer, hoping he'd go away, but the knock came again, soft, hesitant, but insistent. "Lucas," I called out, my voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions swirling inside me. "I need some time alone. Please." There was a long pause, and I thought he'd listened. But then I heard his voice muffled through the door. "Please. I just need to talk." Something in his tone made my resolve waver. I stood, hesitating for a moment before unlocking the door and cracking it open. He stood there, his expression a mix of uncertainty and something deeper, something that made my breath catch. "What is it, Lucas?" I asked, my voice softer now. He didn't answer right away. Instead, he looked at me with an intensity that made the space between us feel smaller. "I can't keep pretending," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "Not after everything." I stepped back, opening the door wider but keeping my distance. "Pretending about what?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. "You know," he said, his gaze never leaving mine. "You feel it too. I know you do." My chest tightened, a mix of anger and fear bubbling to the surface. "Lucas, this has to stop. Whatever you think this is, it's not real." "It is real," he said, stepping into the room. I should have told him to leave, should have stopped him, but I didn't. "I've tried to fight it, tried to push it down, but I can't." His words hit me like a wave, leaving me breathless. "You're my stepson," I said, my voice trembling. This can't happen." "Then why haven't you stopped me?" he asked, his voice quiet but filled with emotion. "Why do you keep letting me get closer?" I had no answer. The truth was I didn't know. I wanted to blame the isolation, the loneliness that had crept into my life over the years. But deep down I knew it was more than that. The connection I felt with Lucas, as wrong as it was, had taken root in a way I couldn't deny. "I don't know," I admitted, my voice barely audible. "I don't know how we got here." He stepped closer, his hand reaching out to brush against mine. The touch sent a jolt through me, and I pulled back instinctively, my heart pounding in my chest. "Lucas, we can't," I said, but my voice lacked the conviction I needed it to have. "Then tell me to leave," he said, his gaze searching mine. "Tell me to go, and I will. But if you don't..." He let the sentence hang in the air, unfinished, as the tension between us grew unbearable. I wanted to say the words, to end this before it spiraled further out of control. But I couldn't. I stood there, frozen, as he stepped even closer, his presence overwhelming. "Lucas," I whispered, my voice trembling. And then it happened. He closed the distance between us, his lips brushing against mine in a kiss that was both tentative and filled with a desperation that mirrored my own. For a moment, I let myself get lost in it, the world outside fading away. But reality came crashing back, and I pulled away, my breathing ragged. "This isn't right," I said, my voice firm despite the way my hands trembled. "I know," he said, his voice heavy with emotion. "But it doesn't feel wrong." Before I could respond, a sharp sound broke the silence, a gasp from the doorway. My heart dropped as I turned to see Jason, my stepson from my previous marriage, standing there. His face was pale, his eyes wide with shock as he took in the scene before him. "Jason," I breathed, my voice barely above a whisper. "This isn't what it looks like." But it was too late. The damage was done. He turned and walked away, his footsteps echoing down the hallway as he disappeared from view. The room felt like it was spinning as I turned back to Lucas, panic rising in my chest. "What have we done?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "We'll fix it," Lucas said, his tone calm despite the storm that had just erupted. "I'll talk to him. I'll make him understand." But I knew it wasn't that simple. The secret we'd tried so hard to contain was out now, and there was no going back. The rest of the night was a blur. Lucas followed Jason, leaving me alone in the suffocating silence of my room. I sat on the edge of the bed, my mind racing with questions and fears. What would Jason do? Would he tell Greg? Would he tell anyone else? When Lucas finally returned, his expression was somber. "He's upset," he said simply. "But he won't say anything." "Not yet. Not yet," I repeated, my voice trembling. "What does that mean?" "It means we have to be careful," he said, his voice steady but tinged with urgency. "We have to figure out what happens next, together." But as I looked at him, the weight of what we'd done pressing down on me, I couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to move forward. The line we'd crossed couldn't be uncrossed, and the fallout had only just begun. The days that followed felt like walking on a tightrope over a pit of uncertainty. Jason's silence was deafening, his avoidance palpable. Every time I tried to approach him, he found a reason to slip away, leaving me alone with the weight of what he'd seen. The easy camaraderie we'd once shared had been replaced by strained glances and cold indifference, and I knew I couldn't let it stay that way. Lucas, too, seemed more cautious than ever, his usually calm demeanor replaced with a quiet intensity. He spent hours in his room, emerging only when necessary. When we were alone, his reassurance was unwavering. He'd tell me we'd get through it, that Jason just needed time. But his words couldn't silence the doubt gnawing at my insides. One evening, as the sun set behind the hills, casting long shadows across the yard, I found Jason on the back porch. He was sitting on the steps, his shoulders hunched as he stared into the distance. My heart ached at the sight of him, but I knew I couldn't avoid this conversation any longer. I approached cautiously, the sound of my footsteps on the wooden boards causing him to glance over his shoulder. His expression was guarded, a mix of hurt and confusion that made my chest tighten. "Jason," I began softly, sitting down a few feet away. "We need to talk." He didn't respond right away, his gaze returning to the horizon. Finally, he let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. "Talk about what?" "How you and Lucas betrayed me. How you destroyed everything I thought I knew about this family." His words hit me like a punch to the gut, but I forced myself to stay calm. "I know you're hurt, and I know you have every right to be," I said, my voice steady despite the turmoil inside me. "But I need you to understand, it wasn't supposed to happen like this." Jason turned to me then, his eyes filled with anger and pain. "How was it supposed to happen, then? Was I not supposed to find out? Were you just going to pretend nothing was wrong while you—" He trailed off, his jaw tightening as he struggled to find the words. I swallowed hard, my hands trembling in my lap. "It wasn't planned," I said quietly. "And it's not something I can justify. But it's not meaningless, Jason. It's not some mistake we can erase." His expression softened slightly, but the hurt in his eyes remained. "Do you even care about what this is doing to me?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Do you even realize how much you've broken my trust?" Tears pricked at the corners of my eyes, but I forced them back. "I care more than you know," I said, my voice trembling. "And I hate that I've hurt you. But I need you to know that it's real. I didn't want it to be, but it is." Jason looked away, his shoulders slumping as he let out a long sigh. "I don't know if I can ever look at either of you the same way again." Silence fell between us, heavy and suffocating. I wanted to reach out to comfort him, but I knew it wasn't what he needed. After a long moment he stood, his movements stiff and uncertain. "I need time," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Time to figure out how I feel about this, about you." I nodded, my heart aching at the finality in his tone. "Take all the time you need," I said, watching as he walked back into the house, leaving me alone on the porch. Lucas found me there a short while later, his expression tense as he sat down beside me. "How did it go?" he asked, his voice low. I shook my head, tears finally spilling down my cheeks. "He's hurt, Lucas. He's so hurt." "I know," he said, his voice heavy with guilt. "And I hate that I've done this to him, to you. But we'll get through it. We have to." The certainty in his tone was comforting, but it didn't erase the weight of what we'd done. The days turned into weeks, each one filled with strained interactions and whispered conversations behind closed doors. Lucas and I tried to keep our connection hidden, but the secrecy only added to the tension in the house. Jason kept his distance, his interactions with both of us brief and perfunctory. It was clear he was struggling to come to terms with what he'd witnessed, and I didn't blame him. I gave him as much space as he needed, even though it tore me apart to see him hurting. One night, as Lucas and I sat in the dim light of the living room, he reached for my hand, his fingers brushing mine gently. "We can't keep living like this," he said softly. "It's not fair to anyone." I nodded, my throat tightening. "But what's the alternative? If we tell Greg, if this gets out?" "I know," he said, his voice laced with frustration. "But we have to figure something out. We can't keep pretending everything's fine." As much as I hated to admit it, he was right. The path we'd chosen was one of secrecy and sacrifice, and it was wearing us down. But the thought of losing him, of losing the fragile connection we'd built, was unbearable. I don't know what the future holds, I said, my voice trembling. But I know I don't want to face it without you. Lucas squeezed my hand, his gaze steady. We'll figure it out. Together. But as I looked into his eyes, filled with determination and vulnerability, I couldn't shake the feeling that the hardest part was yet to come. The weeks stretched into months, and though the initial shock began to fade, the weight of what had happened never left. Jason kept his distance, though there were moments when I caught him watching Lucas and me with an expression I couldn't quite place. It wasn't anger anymore, but it wasn't forgiveness either. It was something in between, an uncertainty that mirrored my own. Lucas remained steadfast, his presence both comforting and a constant reminder of the choices we'd made. He'd taken it upon himself to bridge the gap with Jason, offering olive branches in the form of casual conversations and shared interests. It wasn't perfect, but it was progress. One evening, as we sat together on the porch watching the sun dip below the horizon, I turned to Lucas. "Do you ever regret this?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. He didn't answer right away, his gaze fixed on the fading light. "Regret?" he said finally, his tone thoughtful. "No, but I do wonder if it was worth the pain we've caused." His honesty was like a bomb and a wound all at once. I nodded, my heart heavy with the weight of his words. "I think about that too," I admitted. "About what we've done to Jason, to Greg, to ourselves." Lucas reached for my hand, his grip firm but gentle. "We can't undo the past," he said, "but we can decide what comes next. And I want to face it with you, whatever it is." His words brought me a strange sense of comfort, even as the reality of our situation loomed large. The love we shared, as complicated and forbidden as it was, had become an anchor in a sea of uncertainty. But it wasn't without its cost. Jason eventually began to open up, though it was slow and tentative. One night, as we stood in the kitchen cleaning up after dinner, he finally spoke. "I don't know if I'll ever understand why you did what you did," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "But I'm trying to accept it. For my own sake, if nothing else." His words hit me harder than I expected, and I turned to face him, my eyes brimming with tears. "I don't expect forgiveness," I said. "But I hope one day you can find it in your heart to let go of the anger." He nodded, his expression softening. "I'm working on it," he said simply. It wasn't the resolution I'd hoped for, but it was a start. And sometimes that's all you can ask for. In the end, the love Lucas and I shared became a lesson in boundaries, choices, and the cost of crossing lines that should never be crossed. It taught me about vulnerability, about the ways loneliness can lead us down paths we never imagined. But most importantly, it taught me about accountability. What we had was real, messy, complicated, and imperfect, but it wasn't without consequences. It forced us to confront the parts of ourselves we'd been running from, to face the pain we'd caused and the trust we'd broken. And in doing so, it reminded me of the importance of honesty, not just with others, but with ourselves. As I stood on the porch that night, watching the stars blink to life in the darkening sky, I realized that life doesn't always offer clean resolutions or easy answers. Sometimes it's about finding the strength to move forward, even when the path is uncertain. Lucas joined me, his presence warm and reassuring as he slipped his hand into mine. "We'll figure it out," he said, echoing the promise he'd made so many times before. And as I looked at him, his face lit by the soft glow of the moonlight, I knew he was right. It wouldn't be easy and it might never be perfect. But it was ours, and that was enough. What would you do if you were in Jason's shoes? Could you forgive, or would the betrayal be too much? Share your thoughts in the comments below. I want to hear from you. Don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more shocking and emotional stories like this one. And trust me, you won't want to miss what's coming next. Stay tuned for our next jaw-dropping tale.